And God spake all these words, saying, An altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings, and thy peace offerings, thy sheep, and thine oxen. In all places where I record my name, I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for a time of worship. Today we kick off a new sermon series titled Altars. And for the next few Sundays in the season of Lent, as we prepare for Easter Sunday, we will explore the significance of altars in the biblical story and how they serve as reminders of people and places and events where there was an encounter between God and humanity. Today's story may be a familiar one to you, as it is the account of Jacob's first encounter with the Lord and the altar he built at a place named Bethel, the house of God. Now, if you lean in closely enough to the text, it feels like we are right in the middle of an action thriller suspense. Because you see, Jacob is on the run, and he really should be for his life. Because if we flash back over Jacob's life, we find that even early on, as early as his time in the womb, he has been at odds with his brother Esau. They were described as divided nations. And instead of the boys growing closer together as brothers, they grew apart. In fact, in a moment of vulnerability and desperation, Jacob tricked Esau into selling his birthright for bread and stew. Seeming to be his mom Rebekah's favorite, they then connived together to manipulate his frail and sight-impaired father, Isaac. On a day when Adult Protective Services is not on site, Jacob was able to manipulate and deceive his father into thinking he was the firstborn, and later went on to receive the coveted divine blessings. Now, all of this plotting and scheming reaches a head when Esau learns that he's left with, the leftovers of his father's blessings. Understandably, he's bitter, he's tearful, and sad. And as he replays all of the times that Jacob outwitted him and bested him over the years, that sadness gives way to fury. So much so that Esau begins a plot of his own that says, after my father's funeral, there's going to be one more because I'm going to kill my brother. Now, to put this in technical theological terms, this is a mess. This family puts fun in dysfunctional. And every time I read this account and those like it, I'm encouraged to know that it's not just our modern families that could use some time in counseling. But nevertheless, Rebekah finds out about her son Esau's plot, and she knows that he is a skilled hunter and will kill his prey. And so she sends Jacob away at once. And fleeing from the mess he made, we find Jacob now in the middle of nowhere, alone, and in a very unsafe and tenuous place. His future seems as bleak and as dim as the nightfall that is settling around him. Now, if you've ever been in the middle of nowhere, or if you've been alone or stuck in between what was and what's yet to be, you know, like I know, that the silence is deafening. I imagine if the stones that are surrounding Jacob, if they could talk, they would remind him of what a mess he made of his past. If they could talk, they would remind him that his past disqualified him for his future. And surrounded with these thoughts, Jacob doesn't expect an encounter from anyone, let alone the Lord. So he turns one of those stones into a makeshift pillow and calls it a night and begins to dream. But not just any dream. It's the dream that artwork is inspired by. Artwork such as William Blake's piece, Jacob's Dream. It's a dream that inspired hymns, vacation Bible schools such as I'm Climbing Jacob's Ladder. Because here in this dream, we see how heaven is concerned about earth. In this dream, we see a staircase that starts at earth and goes all the way to heaven. In this dream, we see that messengers of God are descending and ascending the staircase. It is a spectacular dream. And so much commentary and attention has been paid to this visual image that we, if we're not careful, will miss the real amazing part of this dream, the piece of this dream that should take our very breath away. And that is that God appears. Take that in for a moment. That God appears. The Holy One, the God who created the heavens and the earth, the maker and creator of all things seen and unseen, the God who has no beginning and no end and simply goes by the name I am. This God appears to Jacob. And this is truly amazing. I think sometimes we might miss it because we use the word amazing so regularly and so casually. A good meal can be amazing, and a performance can be amazing. Even a big discount or a great deal on Amazon can be amazing. But this, friends, is truly amazing because heaven is connecting with earth. The God who is and gives our very life being and meaning and purpose meets Jacob, comes to Jacob. And what is also so awe-inspiring about this scene is that God comes to someone who, in our estimation, deserves it the least. I mean, if we think about people who we would put on a list for God to visit, it would not be someone who is a trickster, a deceiver, a manipulator, someone that takes advantage of the vulnerable and the elderly. No, they wouldn't make the list. But what is awe-inspiring and what is simply fills the heart with hope is that God comes to those who, in our eyes, may deserve it least. And that means God comes to us all because we are all unworthy of God's holiness. And so here we find that God visits Jacob, who is alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thoughts of a failed past and a very doubtful future. And we see that God encounters him. What's also so noteworthy about this scene is that God, with full knowledge of Jacob's past, doesn't shame him. I mean, in our culture, as soon as Jacob's misdeeds and his past became public knowledge, we'd cancel him and completely disqualify him from public life. But God's coming suggests that God does not cancel Jacob. God does not cast him off. In fact, God gives him a hope and a future. God is not so concerned about rehearsing Jacob's past as much as he's about redirecting his future. And I love that about God because the priority in this encounter is displaying God's grace to remind Jacob that he is not forgotten, that he is not cast off, that he is not disqualified. Now, to be sure, God is altogether holy and God is not complicit in Jacob's hurtful deeds, nor does God ignore them. Jacob will, in fact, reap the consequences of his behavior. But again, God is interested in showing him that when you encounter God, you encounter grace. And that is a beautiful thing. And so here, Jacob, fast asleep, he is experiencing an encounter with God, and he does not expect it. And so the question that is flashing in my mind like a neon sign for you and me is, do we expect God in expected places? Particularly those places where we come to gather to worship the living God, whether that's online or in person. When we gather for worship in an expected place, are we expecting to encounter God? Now, I know God cannot be contained or localized to any one place, but we believe that when we gather, when we come together for our common worship, that is a means of God's grace, that through grace that there's a sign or a word or an action whereby God communicates his favor and an unending love for you and for me. That's what we encounter when we come together in worship. And my question is, are we expecting that? Do we expect to encounter the God who waits with open arms to encounter us? Do we expect to hear or to encounter God when we read from the scriptures or pray the prayers or hear the word proclaimed or come to the table? Do we expect to encounter God when we are in the house of worship and we see the altar, we see the font, we see the people of God gathered? Do we expect to encounter God or not? And if not, what do we expect? What do we expect when we come together for our common worship? Do we expect a certain style of service? Are we expecting a certain singer or a certain speaker? Are we expecting the service to be a certain length and not a minute longer? Are we expecting the preacher to preach on certain topics and stay away from others? Are we expecting a certain style of music? What do we expect when we gather for worship? To be sure, I believe that we are all entitled to our expectations and even our preferences in worship. But what I submit to you is that there is one expectation that should rise above all others, and that is the expectation that when we come together to worship, that we will encounter the living God, the God who is pleased to meet us in our worship, the God who is pleased to extend grace to us in our worship. What are you expecting? It's awe-inspiring to come into the presence of the living God, to encounter God, and it's something that we don't want to miss. In a spirit of confession, I must admit that when I was a young girl, I fell asleep quite often in church. And I don't mean just the bobbing of the head and the neck snap. I mean the full on using my parents' lap or shoulder as a makeshift pillow, much like Jacob. And whenever that happened, there were two things that I could be sure of that I would be forced to do. One is to take a nap after church rather than play after church, because clearly I needed to catch up on my rest. And the other was that I would go back to church for the afternoon worship service. Because the idea in our household growing up was that, one, sleeping in worship was just disrespectful to God's house, but two, that something was lost, that an opportunity was missed by my sleeping, that I missed a word or an action or a deed or a gesture or a glimpse that somehow invited me into an encounter with the living God. And friends, I wonder that when we don't come into our common worship again, whether it is online or in person, when we don't bring that expectation with us, I wonder if it's like we are sleeping in worship. We're not expecting, we're missing out on what God desires to give every one of us. And so I invite you, as churches everywhere are beginning to resume in-person worship, raise the level of expectation that when we come together for worship, we come expecting to encounter the God who reveals self to us. The other wonderful thing about this story, if we go back to a sleeping Jacob, is that God not only comes, but God also speaks. That God speaks to him words of affirmation, words of promise, words of protection and provision. Unlike his earthly father, Isaac, God cannot be manipulated or coerced into his appearing or his blessings. No, God gives this just out of the generosity, the beneficence of God's very being. God, in his speech, gives to Jacob the promises made to Abraham and Isaac, promises of land and a multitude of descendants, and a promise that through him, the nation would be a beacon of blessing to all other nations. And since God was fully aware that Jacob was on the run for his life, God also provided assurance of God's protection. He says, behold, look, pay attention, lean in closely. I am with you. And in this amazing act of faithfulness, yes, it is amazing, that God binds himself. God binds God's self to Jacob as Jacob's presence. He says, know that I am with you. God binds self to Jacob as his protection. I'll keep you wherever you go and bring you back to this place. God binds God's self as his promise. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Can you see it? In the middle of nowhere, God paints a future that is so bright, and it is so tied to God's eternal redemptive plan that God has to be in the middle of it for it to succeed. God, this encounter with the Lord changes the whole trajectory of Jacob's life and places him on such a firm footing, one that's not based on manipulation or deceit, but based on God's eternal purposes for all humanity. That is amazing. So when we come into our common worship, God also reminds us that I bind myself to you. I am also with you. I will also protect you in your going out and your coming in. My presence will be with you. And when we come into this place, into this common worship, we are surrounded by reminders of this truth, the means of God's grace that God channels to us. We are reminded in the scripture, those beautiful and memorable verses such as Psalm 23. Where the psalmist says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. Or in that wonderful, heartwarming passage in Isaiah 41, where God tells the people of Israel, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. Or in the decisive act in the giving of Jesus Christ, whose very name is Emmanuel, God with us. And at the end of his ministry in the Matthean gospel, Jesus even says it, "Lo, I am with you always." And so when we gather for worship, this is what we can expect to receive in our encounter with the Lord. Words of assurance, "I am with you." Words of hope, "I will never leave you." Words of provision, "I will bless you and keep you." Words of responsibility, "I want you to be a blessing to all people on earth. I want you to be the light of the world, a city on a hill." When we encounter the Lord, friends, we encounter one who is able to change us, to transform the whole trajectory of our life and our future. So what do you expect when you gather in the presence of the Lord in these expected places? I invite you to raise your level of expectation to encounter the God who not only comes to us, but the God who binds self to us, promising words of hope, promising a future. So Jacob awakes from his sleep and he remarks, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He is awestruck and he knows this wasn't just any ordinary dream. No, he has been in the presence of the Lord. And it's one of those moments like the birth of a child, or those once in a lifetime encounters where you just can't take enough pictures or capture enough video. No, Jacob proceeds to capture this moment, memorialize this moment. What was his pillow of stone now becomes a stone pillar. And he anoints it with oil so that it is recognizable, and calls this place Bethel, the house of God, the place of God. And he remarks, "How awesome is this place." He is changed, and so is this space. It becomes a reminder that God is for us, that God will come to us. You know, when I think of this, I'm amazed. I think about my own past. I think about being in those in-between places and those moments that God has come to me. And my hope and my prayer for us as we engage in worship, whether again it is online or in person, is that we are expecting to encounter the God who loves us, the God who sustains us, the God who created us and gives our very existence meaning and purpose. My prayer is that we encounter this God who comes to us with arms wide open, saying, "If you draw near to me, I won't retreat. I will draw near to you." That is the God that we encounter in our common worship. And that is the God that I pray that we all experience over and over again, that our lives are transformed. You know, one of the common complaints that I would hear even before the pandemic disrupted our patterns of worship, I would often hear people say, "I just don't get anything out of worship." And I have made those same statements. But as I grow older and as I walk with the Lord, and as God begins to reveal self to me more and more, the question that I'm learning to ask of myself and ask of others when I hear that is, what are you bringing to worship? What are you bringing that would facilitate, that would make your heart open and aware and alert to such an encounter? And I'm reminded that it takes a bit of preparation to come ready for worship. When I commuted to work on the bus, I remember carrying a rolling bag that housed my computer. I had a tote that on my shoulder that had lots of books and other miscellaneous things. I had my backpack purse. I had a lunch kit, and some mornings I had a garment bag for my robe. I know it was way too much, and getting on and off the bus was just problematic. And when I would arrive to our downtown campus, I remember the security guard always chuckling at me saying, "Are you moving in today?" And I would smile and say, "No, these are just things I need for work today." And so, friends, I believe that there are some things that we need to carry into worship every Sunday to facilitate an encounter with the living God. One thing that we should always bring is an expectant heart. I expect when I come in this place, when I gather with my family around, whether it's a computer or a tablet or a phone or a television, I expect that we will encounter the living God, whether it is through a prayer or a song or an anthem or the proclamation of a word. We bring with us an expectant heart. I would also offer that we bring repentant hearts, remembering that God is holy and that we are not, and that God comes to us even though we don't deserve it. And so we come to God with a repentant heart, repenting of those things that we have done where we have fallen short, where we have not lived up to God's standard of holiness. I believe we should also carry humility, remembering that we don't manipulate God. We cannot coerce God or force God to come, but that we come with humble hearts, knowing that God comes to us out of an abundance of love and care for us. I believe whether we are, again, worshiping in an online environment or in person, that we come with ourself, that we bring ourself. We are embodied creatures. And so come to worship with lifted up hands. Come ready to sing the songs. Come ready to clap. Come ready to pray the prayers and read the scriptures and hear the word. Bring your whole self. Bring your undivided attention, expecting to encounter the living God. And furthermore, I believe we should bring an eye for all that is going on around us. If you are at home, surround yourself with reminders of God's presence. Perhaps it's a candle that reminds you of Jesus Christ, who is the light of the world, or a physical copy of the scriptures that remind you that God is speaking to us through his written text, our primary source of God's revelation. Perhaps you bring other symbols or reminders that, yes, God is with me. God is in this place. If you are in a physical space, look around. Look at the altar. Look at the baptistry. Look at the font. Look at these stained glass windows and allow God to help you notice God's presence in this holy place. And finally, I would encourage you to bring an openness for change. Be open to leaving God's presence very differently than when you came, because it is impossible to come into the presence of the living God day in and day out and not be changed. And so the season of Lent, it helps us in this regard. It helps us move away those things from our lives and our heart that prevent us from being aware and alert to God's presence, and helps clarify our vision for God, helps us to see God and encounter the presence of the living God. And so, friends, that is my prayer for us this season, that you remember that the God who comes to us, God does so because of God's great love for us. And God speaks words of affirmation and promises of God's presence, God's provision, God's protection, and God's faithfulness to you, to never leave you and me and never forsake us. And when we come into our common worship with an expectant heart, we will be able to say, like Jacob, surely the Lord is in this place. But unlike Jacob, we will be able to say, and I know it. Let's pray. Eternal God, how awesome is your holy presence. You are enthroned in the heavenly places, and yet you are pleased to draw near to us in the unexpected and expected places in life. So thank you for the ways you reveal yourself to us through prayer, through scripture, through the table, through our common worship. In all these means of your grace, give us a heartfelt, a yearning and expectation to encounter your holy presence. Throughout this season of Lent, clear away from our hearts all that makes it hard to recognize your presence, that at the arrival of Easter, we experience transformed lives made possible by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We love you and trust you and offer you now the words Jesus taught his disciples to pray, saying together, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.